In part 5 of this series, we'll take a look at animation in Unreal. We'll take a look at how animation differs between Maya and Unreal. We'll do a deep dive into the sequencer, and then we'll set up some example animations. Hey, welcome back to part 5. We're going to learn all about animation in Unreal in this one. So I've got an Unreal scene here where we're continuing on again from where we left off on part 4. And I've already set up a couple of things since we've already learned how to do most of this already. So I've got a new level in here, and I've put in an HDRI backdrop, a plane, and a cube. And we've also got a directional light in here, kind of adding to the shadows in our scene. All right, so animation in Unreal works a little bit differently from how it does in Maya. Right, so if we pop over to Maya, so you're probably used to animating directly on objects in Maya, where, maybe say we've got an object in here and we'll use this as a starting point. We'll keyframe it there, go to another frame and tell it its endpoint. And since we have auto key turned on, all of a sudden we've got an animation, right? You can tweak things about these animations using features like the graph editor here. So for example, we could add more easing onto these by adjusting our tangents. So we can have more of a dramatic ease in, ease out. And we can visualize these things like putting ghosting on our objects. There's lots of great animation tools in Maya. It's one of the premier tools for animation really in the 3D industry. We've got a lot of great tools in Unreal for animation as well. And so we'll just go over there and start talking about how animation data in Unreal works. So in Unreal, you can see in our interface here, we don't have a timeline of any sort, right? There's nothing here that shows that I can put keyframes on anything. There's a tool in Unreal called the sequencer that allows you to do that. All right, so if you go to Windows Cinematics Sequencer, here's our sequencer, but it's empty, right? There's nothing here. There's still no timeline. There's no place to add keyframes. And this is where a new asset type comes in. This is where level sequences come into play. Objects in Unreal, we don't animate directly on them. We create an animation asset called a level sequence where animation data is stored on that asset rather than the actor itself. And one reason why this is so powerful is that we can animate one actor as many different ways as we want. For example, if you have a car, you want one animation of it spinning in a 360. You want another animation of it, driving into the frame. You want another one where just the doors open. We can have one asset in our level that we can animate multiple times. We can interchangeably take these animations in and out of our project. So to make a level sequence actor, there is a couple of ways to do it. If you're in a level that you want to create an animation asset for, you can go to this menu right here that says add level sequence. So this will create a level sequence for you, and it's going to have you choose a place to save this asset and give it a name. So whenever I'm making sequences in Unreal for animation, I'll make a folder in my project and we call this sequences. And then inside this folder, we're going to call this SEQ _ box animation, for example. So now you see we get a level sequence actor in our scene, which is referencing a level sequence asset. So remember, as actors and assets, this is another type of actor that references an asset in our content browser. So here it is. And again, here's our magnifying glass. If we want to see where that asset lives, click the magnifying glass, and there it is. All right, so this interface here is the sequencer in Unreal. So this looks a little bit more familiar. We've got a timeline. We've got a place to show tracks in here. And so far, this sequencer is just empty, right? For example, if we wanted to animate this box that we have here, we need to add it to our sequencer and create some animation tracks for it. So we can see in the sequencer here, there's this plus add button. This is going to have a lot of options in it for adding different types of tracks. And we'll talk more about tracks here. we can also add an actor to the sequencer to start keyframing different attributes about this actor, right? So we're going to add cube here. We can also select anything else that's in our level, but we'll add the cube. And you can see by default here, we've got the overall track name, which is this static mesh asset, cube. And it currently has one track in here, which is a transform track. So if we open this dropdown, we can see we have individual transform tracks for location, rotation, and scale. And we can keyframe each of these individually, or we can keyframe them all at the same time. And we'll show how to do that here. If we want to start animating this cube, we can create a keyframe at its start point here. So let's say maybe we want to start here in this location. So we're going to keyframe with this button right here at that location. It'll create a keyframe on our timeline. And then we want to go to a different position in the timeline, like frame 120, move our asset, and then keyframe it again. So we can see we have two keyframes. They have this thin little line that's drawn between them. And if we play our animation, we'll see that animation happen. So you can see a couple of things out of the gate here about how the default settings in Sequencer work for animation in Unreal. So this animation with these two keyframes that we just made, we can see that we've got easing active already by default. So it starts slow, picks up speed, goes at a constant rate, and then slows down again. And we can see that just like in Maya with the curve editor. So in Maya, this is called the graph editor. In Unreal, it's called the curve editor. And they work almost exactly the same way. So if you're familiar with working in the graph editor, you'll feel right at home here. So we can take our handles on these. We can right click and say weighted tangents, just like we did over in Maya. And we can start adjusting these values. So say weighted tangents, pull this over. So now we've got some pretty heavy easing going on this animation. So really easy to customize keyframes, adjust their timing. We can just grab keyframes and slide them around here, which is really, really nice. So there's a few cool things about this interface and the way it works. So if we pause our animation, we'll see our object that we have in our viewport. We can see a representation of those keyframes that we made, and it also draws a motion path between them by default here. So we can see the path that this asset is going to take as long as we're not currently playing the animation. And so we can use this to kind of fine tune where stuff is and what its path is going to be. And since this is just a straight A to B kind of linear animation here, it isn't really giving us that much, but say we want this to kind of travel along a curve here. Keyframing in Unreal, right now I've got auto key turned off, and that is going to be this button right here. So if we turn this on, say we go at the halfway point in our animation here, and we want this to kind of dip off to the side before it hits its endpoint. So we can move the animation here, and we'll see that motion trail adjust to fit that. So we can press play, kind of zoom across, and reach its endpoint. And so that animation is super ugly. We would want to take a look at our curve editor here and see what's going on. So, since we made those handles on these really long, we're going to have some pretty ugly stuff happening in the middle here. So we'll take these, make those short again, and we'll take this middle keyframe and just kind of rotate this so that it smooths out. And we see a nice smooth looking curve. We should see the same in our viewport here. This is one thing that I really like about Unreal, is that it's very easy to visualize how smooth your animation is going to be using this motion trail. So now if we take a look at this and see what we get, let's go back to the beginning here with this back to front button, and we'll press play. So we get a nice smooth animation now. We kind of got rid of that jitter. So that's a basic animation. Not really a whole lot going on for this, just some basic keyframes in here. Let's talk a little bit more about these keyframes. So we're going to delete these ones, and we're going to reset our actor position. And let's set up a different kind of animation here. So one thing that we do a lot for automotive is just rotate things in a 360-degree angle. And so we could do that here as well. So I'm going to do this only on the rotation track. So I'm going to say at frame 0, we'll set a keyframe. And then at frame 100, we'll set another keyframe. And so in these tracks here, if you select one, you'll see that object get selected in your outliner. So this is almost like selecting things directly in your outliner here. So I'll select my cube and I can see its transform information. And if I'm on the same frame as I have a keyframe here, I can type in new values. And since I have auto key turned on, it'll update that keyframe. So let's say on frame 100, we want our rotation on the Z or the yaw axis here to be 360. So now when we play our animation, it's going to rotate 360 degrees. And we've got some dead space on the end of our animation here, and that's really what these green and red bars are. This is the start frame and end frame, or our working range if you're thinking in Maya terms. So we can pull this working range down so that we end on frame 100 here. So we'll go back to frame 0, press play, and we get our animation here. But since we have easing turned on by default, it kind of starts at a stop. It picks up speed, goes, and then slows down again. And when we're doing 360 spins, whether this is for a turntable on a demo reel or for an automotive shot, you don't really want that easing in there. So we'll go back to frame 0. We can drag and select both of these keyframes. Then you can right click them and turn these into linear keyframes. So if you turn these into linear keyframes, they'll turn into little triangles on the time slider here. And now, if we play this, these are just going to go at a constant rate. There's no easing happening. There's no speed up, slow down. And so this is perfect for something like trying to render very precise angles over 360, right? So one great use case for this is a 36 angle spin of a car, right? So if we take our end frame and set that to frame 36, so we're going at a constant rate. The great thing about this is that every one of these keyframes, the object is rotating 10 degrees, right? So it's very precise. So if we select our object here and we can watch this rotation channel here, go to frame 1, it's 10 degrees, 20, 30, 40, and so on, all the way down to the end, where it is a full 360 degrees. So nice for doing very precise angles when you're rotating a 360 for your car or your asset, whatever you're rendering here. And you can change this to be any length that you want and just kind of work with math to make sure that those angles are nice even numbers. Like 36 frames works well, 360 frames works well, if you want to have things really smooth in your final render. So you have a lot of freedom here to change that. So we've animated a 360 on this square here, and maybe we're happy with that. So we want to save what we've done here. So we've got this level sequence currently loaded into our sequencer, and we can see what sequence we're currently working in a couple of different places here. So if we're in our cinematic viewport, which is where we should have left off on our last class, we will be able to see this sequence box animation here on the bottom left of our screen. And also in the sequencer on the top right here, we've got the same name, sequence box animation. So just really clear that that's the animation sequence that you're working in. If we save this here, we can come in and create another level sequence, so add level sequence. And we're going to call this one SEQ box animation slide. So we're back to an empty sequencer here. So we're going to add our cube. And for this one, we're going to say we start here. We'll keyframe this. We'll go to frame 100 and we'll move our box over. And we'll set our end frame to 100. You can also type in your start and end frames as long as you're in the cinematic viewport here with this green number and the red number. That's the start and end render frame. These gray ones right next to it, that's going to be like extra working space in the UI here. So you can see if we set this to 0, the green playhead goes all the way to the end. And if we set this one to 100, that'll go all the way to the end. I like having a little bit of breathing room in here, so like 120 and -20, just so we can see these handles really clearly and click on them really easily. It's nice just to have a little bit of room. So now if we play this animation, we've got our box sliding, right? So this is the same box that we animated at 360 for, but now we've done a second animation on it. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we can have multiple animations on the same asset, and this is super powerful in Unreal. It's really easy to switch things out and try different things. You're going to try 5 different iterations of a single animation and send those out to review and have your client pick what they like best. Very easy to duplicate, make some fine adjustments, duplicate, make fine adjustments, and so on and so on. So switching between which animation you have open is really easy. So we'll save this one. And you can see in our outliner here, when we created the level sequence in this way, it creates them in the outliner as an actor, and part of that UI here in the details is open level sequence. So this first one that we created, if we hit open level sequence, now we're in the 360 animation. Select this one, open level sequence, now we're in the slide animation. So you can have as many animations as you want in one scene, and kind of just work with all of these, one after the other. You can jump back and forth between them, make adjustments. It's super, super flexible, and it's really easy to move things around. If you want to just close down out of the sequencer, one of the easiest things to do is just to close the sequencer tab. That'll close any level sequence that you currently have open, and your object should be reset to the position that it was outside of the sequence. So I want to talk about that briefly here. So this actor in our level, when no sequence is open, we can see it lives at the location 0056, right? Its rotation is 0, scale is 1. And one useful thing about level sequences, so if we create another one here, we'll call this sequence location example. So this actor is not currently a part of this sequence, right? If I move this right now without adding it as a track, I can close this sequence. The actor is going to stay there, so this wasn't a translation override in that sequence. So we'll undo that. We'll open that sequence back up. And this time we'll add this actor to the sequencer, add our cube, and now we're going to move it, but we're not going to keyframe it, right? So there's no keyframes on this, and we're going to save this sequence. So now when we close this sequence, the asset pops back to where it was outside of that sequence. So this is a really powerful thing about level sequences in Unreal, is that it automatically acts as a location override as long as that actor has been added to that sequence as an actor track. So we'll open up that one more time. It pops over to where it was in this sequence. All right, so it's a powerful thing, but it's also something to be really aware of. Make sure that you're doing this intentionally. It's really easy to accidentally have a sequence open and set up some stuff about your car or your product shot that you're working on, whatever you're working on. And then you go to close your sequence and you're like, oh crap, everything is in a different spot now. What did I do? And you might have to dig through different level sequences to kind of figure out, like, where did I get this? How did I get this into place? What happened? And then also the problem becomes, how do I get that information out of my sequencer? So avoid all of those headaches and just be aware that this automatically overrides the position of any actor that you add to a level sequence. So the next thing that we want to talk about here is cameras in the sequencer here. So I'm going to create another level sequence, and we're going to call this SEQ camera example. And so you can have cameras in your scene and add them to the sequencer. So let's do that first. So we'll make a new scene camera actor. And we'll say that it's here. First of all, let's zero it out. And we'll say it's here. So we've got our shot of our cube. So we can say add actor to sequencer, and then add scene camera actor. So a couple things happens whenever you add an actor to a level sequence. So first of all, it adds it as an actor track, right? But it also creates this camera cuts track, and it adds that camera automatically. So a camera cuts track is a way of telling the sequence, where does your shot begin and end? And especially if you have multiple cameras in sequence, this is how you would define when you switch between the cameras. So if I go ahead and add a second camera in here, and we'll eject from our camera view here with the eject button. And we'll say maybe this one is over here. It's going to go like a 3/4 view. We got two cameras in here. And now in our sequencer, if we say add actor to sequencer, add scene camera actor 2. So now we've got two cameras in here. And you'll see there's this little camera icon in the sequencer, and one of them or none of them will be lit up blue. And what that means when it's lit up blue is that you're looking through that camera. So I'm looking through camera 2, looking through camera 1. The one on the camera cuts track, it's going to look through whatever camera is currently associated with the camera cut at this point on the timeline. So right now, like on frame 0 through 150, this is all one camera cut, right? So if we select our camera cuts here, and wherever we're at on our timeline, so maybe frame 60, if we say plus here, new binding actor 2, it's going to cut our timeline right there, so we can see this little separation. And now will be, this one's associated with Cine Camera Actor, this one's associated with Cine Camera Actor 2. So now if we look through our camera cuts and we move our timeline, it's going to cut the cameras between those two cameras, right? So shot 1 and shot 2. And so we can animate stuff about these cameras, independently on each one of these cuts, right? So maybe we say on frame 0, we start here, and on frame 59, we're going to push in our camera a bit here. So we push in. So now our animation pushes in on the cube, switches to the other camera. Let's add a little bit of movement to the second camera. So on frame 60, we'll keyframe. And then on frame 150, and you can see there's this issue where our working range, our render range ends on frame 150, but I can't actually go to frame 150 without it popping my camera out. This has to do with the ends of the camera cut track, right? So you can grab either end of these and pull them outside of your working range. Now I can go all the way to frame 150 and beyond until we come out of that camera cut track. It's because we're looking through our camera cuts right now, right? So if we deselect this, we're not looking through any camera. We can look through shot 1, and as we progress our timeline, we're always going to be looking through shot 1, even no matter what is going on with the camera cuts. I can always look through shot 2, or I can look through our cuts. Right, so if you want to fly around the viewport with one of your render cameras, you can't be looking through the camera cuts. That's one limitation of this. So if you want to fly around the viewport and kind of position for the end of a camera move, you need to be looking through that camera specifically. So we'll look through camera 2, go to frame 150, and maybe you want our animation to just kind of pan over and look from this side. So now the camera moves, and that's fine. So we'll look through our camera cuts again, go back to frame 0, and we'll play and see what we've got. So we have our first shot, and we have our second shot, and they currently cut on frame 60. We've got animation on both cameras. Okay. So that is setting up cameras in our sequencer here just to do basic animation. Okay, so remember I said there's multiple ways to add cameras to a sequence. Let's show the other way, which is actually going to be the way I prefer to do things most of the time. So I'm going to close this sequence, and I'm going to remove all of these from our level. So when I delete these, this is going to delete the actors, but not the assets they reference. So that's kind of one thing that we haven't really talked about yet. When you have actors that reference assets, if you delete the actor, it's not going to delete the asset that they're referencing. So just one thing to keep in mind. So we're going to create another new level sequence. And we're going to call this one SEQ spawned cameras. And make sure we're in our sequences folder and save. And so if you want to, you can create cameras that are unique to this sequence. They won't live in your level. This is technically a different type of actor entirely. We're going to click this button right here, this little camera icon. So you can see it says create a new camera and set it as the current camera cut. So we'll click this button and we'll collapse all of its tracks. And the one thing that's different about this is you'll see a little orange lightning bolt on this one. Okay, so this is to indicate that this actor is being spawned by this sequence. So spawning is a concept in Unreal. It's typically for video game stuff. Whenever you hear about things being spawned, you know, it's a video game concept where something will come into existence when an event happens. It'll do its little job, and then typically it will be killed off or deleted or unspawned. But we can spawn assets as part of a sequence, and one of the things I like to use that for is cameras. So we spawned a camera, and in our outliner here, you can see this little lightning bolt thing right next to this actor, and this is to indicate that this is a spawned actor, right? And if you don't have this lightning bolt here in your outliner, you may need to right click at the top and show the spawnable checkbox here. So you'll see which actors are being spawned. So this sequence spawns that camera. If we close this sequence, that camera goes away, right? So just for extra clarity, we'll delete these other two that we created last time. And for this, if we try to delete something that is associated with a sequence, you'll get this warning. And basically it says, you know, this actor is referenced by other actors or objects. Do you really want to delete it? This will break references. So we'll hit yes. It's going to give me the warning twice because I have two selected. Yes. And just to show what happens when you do that, we'll open up our camera example sequence by double clicking, and you'll see that these two tracks turn red because the actors that these are referencing, specifically in the level that they're referencing, they're no longer there, right? So it's like those references have been broken. Okay. So that's what happens when you delete assets in a level that are being referenced by a sequence. So we'll open up our spawned cameras, and we can treat this just like any camera that we have in our project, right? So we can fly through it, we can do everything we can do with cameras with this spawned camera. And say we like that, we'll save it, close our sequence, again, it goes away, right? So you can spawn quite a few different things in the sequencer. And I want to kind of take this opportunity to talk about a couple of things about cameras, specifically for animation here. So we scrolled right past this in the last class, but there's a couple of things in the camera details pane that are interesting for animation. The first one is going to be the look at tracking settings. So this first section here, enable look at tracking, we'll turn this on. And you'll see right beneath that down here is actor to track, which is currently set to none. So we can have a camera track an actor, which works exactly like the camera and aim system in Maya. So in Maya, if you created a camera and aim, you know, from our create menus, you get a camera node and you get an aim node, and that camera always looks at the aim node. So we can do the same thing here in Unreal, but we can have this camera track anything, right? So one of the things that I like to use really frequently for this is called a target point. And if you wanted to create one from the Place Actors panel, you can do that by searching for target, and then you get target point. So we can create one of these and put this somewhere in our level. Then we select our camera, this actor to track. This is looking at everything in the outliner, right? So we can select our target point from that. So now whenever we move our camera, it's always going to look at that target point. So for example, if we take our target point and reset it to the origin, move it up till it's in the center of that box, now we can animate our camera. So we'll keyframe its transform position, move the timeline, and move our camera over. We don't have to worry about keyframing the rotation of our camera. It's just now always going to track it, which is really nice for setting up really specific shots. And what I want to do is add it to our sequencer, and I want to show an alternative way of adding stuff to the sequencer here. So instead of saying add going through this menu, you can just drag things into the sequencer from your outliner. So dragging from here all the way over to my tracks and drop. And now I've got a track for the target point. So on our Cine Camera actor, I'm going to set it as the target point. And on the target point track, if you right click this, up towards the top, there's going to be this option for convert to spawnable. So if we click this, it becomes a spawned actor now. Now it lives in the sequence permanently. So just to show what I mean there, we can save this, close our sequence, and now that camera and the target point both go away. So we open our sequence, there they both are. So this is a really nice feature of the sequencer in Unreal, where we can have lots of assets that are specific to an individual shot. And we maybe don't want all of those things cluttering our outliner. Particularly this is useful for camera stuff, right? So different cameras, the points that they're aiming at, the points that they're focusing on, those things are specific to an individual shot. I would make them spawnable so that if you're working in a different shot, you don't have 50 camera icons in your viewport making it impossible to see anything. Super, super useful for that. And that's going to take us to the next point here. So we looked at how to track different actors in our scene. So we're going to use target points for that. We can also use target points to track focus on a camera. And so for these nice animated shots here, say we want to also change the focus of this camera as it goes along. So if we start here, we can just animate the focus distance on our camera, but this is really kind of generic to just a certain Z depth of our camera, right? What if we want that focus point to kind of travel around the screen a little bit to track a subject that's flying across in our shot? What we could do for that is create another target point. So we'll make another one of these. And so we'll rename this object to focus point. And then we'll rename that first one to aim point. Okay, so we got aim point and focus point. I'm going to take focus point and drop it into the sequencer. And I'm going to convert this to spawnable. Okay. So our camera down under focus settings. So now we can change focus method from manual to tracking. Right, so instead of typing in a value every time, it's just always going to focus on the depth and position of whatever it's tracking. Under tracking focus settings, so you see we get actor to track here, which is currently set to none. So the weird thing about this is if you open up this dropdown, we're not going to see spawned actors in this dropdown, right? So there's really no way to add this actor to this slot without deselecting our camera. If I try to say select actor in the viewport and click on something, it's not going to work. I can't pick an actor from the scene. Unfortunately, there's no great way to do this. The only way that I know of to get around this is to keyframe this attribute to create a track for it. But the reason for that is if I try to add a track for focus settings, tracking focus settings, this is just going to add a relative offset for that, which is a little bit strange. I'm not sure why this isn't more easily accessible. The easiest thing that you can do is for this actor to track, just create a keyframe for this property, and it'll add that as a track, which currently says unresolved binding. Now from this dropdown, we can say focus point, and we can see that it is the spawned focus point. So this camera now is always going to focus on our focus point actor, so wherever this is in our shot. So we'll save this just to verify that we kept all of our connections here. We'll close this sequence and reopen it. And we can see that the spawnable actors are still there. It's still pointing to the focus point, and we should be good to go. Okay. So you can see here on our actor to track, for the look at tracking, it's giving me an error for a broken reference to an actor ID. So if we open this drop down, we can see it doesn't show up here We're going to have to do that same trick for this. So we can add a keyframe, and now we can select it from this dropdown, and it resolves itself. So a couple of weird things about using spawned actors as tracking points for aim and focus. Just know you can get around them using that trick to create a track with the keyframe. So now we've got all the tools that we need to set up a shot that has custom tracking and focus tracking. So we can look through our camera and see what we get here. We can see our focus is kind of a little out of focus for this. So we may want to move our focus point. So we'll come out of our camera and we can see where this is located in our shot. So we probably want this to be on our cube here. So we'll keep this here. We'll look through our shot again, and now it should be in focus the whole time. So maybe we want our focus to start really close to the camera so we're out of focus. So we can do that here. So we'll go to frame 0, come out of our camera, and we want this to be at the same position of the camera. There's a way to copy and paste attributes for these. So for example, if I want the location of our camera, so under the transform here, instead of coming in and copying and pasting each one of these individually, you can just right click on this location dropdown and say copy. And then if we select our focus point, we can right click on location and say paste. So that moves it right over to where our camera position is. And then we can move this forward just a little bit and look through our camera. So everything's out of focus. And so maybe we want at the end of our shot that for that focus point to travel to the center of the cube, which will kind of give us a rack focus effect. So to do that, we need to keyframe the position of our focus point. So it already has a transform track, as most things do by default. So we'll set a keyframe here, go to the end of our shot, and then we're just going to move that focus point to the center of our cube. Okay, so we'll just kind of move over here so we can see it, and our keyframe updates automatically with auto key. So now if we look through our shot, it's out of focus, and then comes into focus. So you can see I got the timing of this a little mixed up because our camera travels and ends on frame 107, and I made the focus point actor travel all the way at the end of our working range. So I'll fix that just by dragging that and snapping to that other keyframe. So now we get this effect nice and smooth. Okay. So that's animating aim points and focus points on spawned camera systems. So really nice. We can save this, close our sequence. Our outliner is super clean. None of those actors are there anymore. And we can start working on our next shot. So there's a few more details that I'd love to show for the sequencer UI here. So we're going to add another sequence, and we'll call this just UI info. I'm not actually going to add much to this, but I want to show some more features here. So in this level sequence, we'll create a camera track. It's a spawnable camera. And then we're going to animate this just to do something simple. So we'll start here, move our playhead, come over here, and we get a keyframe. So we get this kind of animation here. So I'll set that as my endpoint. And if I play this, it'll just loop us through. If you don't have looping enabled, because I realize this isn't a default thing, there's this little button here on the cinematic viewport overlay for looping. So no looping is the default. Just click it once, it'll play back in a loop every time. So we get looping. We can also play in reverse, which is nice for kind of taking a different look at things. Play forward. You can jump between keyframes within the selected track. So like if I have this one selected here and I say jump to the next keyframe, it'll just look for the next keyframe in any subtrack of this track here. So it has keyframes all the way down on the transform, which is a child track of Cine Camera Actor. So it'll find it here. If I select the camera cuts and jump to the next keyframe, you'll see it doesn't really do anything because there's no keyframes on this. So you're going to make sure you have something selected. a few more things about Sequencer here that are pretty nice for kind of mocking up in edit in Unreal is under this plus add for adding a track. One thing that's kind of nice is the fade track. So fade is going to control just like an overall fade of your screen going from, basically transparent to black, right? So if we increase this value up to 1, it's going to fade our screen to black. So if we set this to 1 and keyframe it, and then say we want to fade in over 10 frames, now we can set this to 0, and we'll see this kind of overlay in here for where it's black and where it becomes visible. So now our camera is going to fade in at the beginning. Maybe we pull this out so it's a little bit more obvious. So we'll play, fades in, and maybe we want to fade out on the last few frames here as well. So we'll keyframe it again, go to the end, and set that to 1 again. And set that to 1 again. And set that to 1 again. Dude, come on. What the hell? And set that to 1 again. So now when we play, fades in and fades out. So that's a fade track. You can kind of cut between your cameras with a fade that way, customize this enough. So we can also add audio tracks in here. So if we add an audio track, we can use this to add a piece of media that's in our project. So all of these sound waves that we have in here, we can say, we can choose one of these and now it'll drop that on the playhead. So we can position this, and if we play, we get that little sound effect come through. So if you want to have like audio for a scene or a piece of music that goes along with your shot, you can drop that in this way. You just have to make sure that you have imported that into your project already, which remember for example, in our audio folder in the starter content, these were all assets that lived on our computer. Theoretically, these are assets that live on your computer, and you drag and drop them into your content browser to import them, and it'll automatically decide what type of asset that is. And like these are all sound waves. So as long as those are in your project, you can add them to an audio track. So one more really interesting thing about Sequencer in Unreal is that you can animate properties of materials through the Sequencer. And it's a little bit of a setup to do it. So we'll do a really simple one here. But it's called a material parameter collection. So under the add track menu, there is material parameter collection track, and you have to have one already created in order for this to work. So you can see there's one that comes in the starter content. We're not going to use this. We're going to create one from scratch. So to do that, we're going to go to our materials folder, and we're going to create a new folder in here for material parameter collection, or MPC. So in this, we'll go to the right-click menu, go to Material, and down here is Material Parameter Collection. We'll create one of these, and we'll call this MPC Plastic Color. And the way these work is, this is a data asset in Unreal, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but essentially we need to provide a parameter definition here that we will then place into our material, right? So if we want to change the color of a plastic material like this, we know that that's a vector parameter. Remember, because if we were building materials, color is a vector node. So we'll add a vector parameter, and we're going to call this diffuse albedo. And we'll set the default value to something like a medium gray. Okay, so we've got that. So now we save this and close it. So now we've got this asset in our project that we can use to customize the color of a material. So we're going to create a new material for this, just as an example. Call this MPC material. And it's good to be kind of sparing with these because you'll see in a moment why this is a little bit difficult to control. So we're going to create a really basic material here, and we're going to drive our diffuse albedo using that MPC asset that we just made. So from our content browser, we're going to drag this in and connect it up to diffuse albedo. And from this node here with this selected, under parameter name, we select diffuse albedo here. So now it's passing that default value through to the diffuse albedo here, and we can save this. So what's a little bit weird about hooking things up this way, for example, if I create a material instance of this for MI MPC material and open it, we can see we don't have a parameter here for diffuse albedo like we normally would with a vector 3 parameter node, right? So how would I customize this and just use this as a material? You know, it's a little bit of a very niche use case, but in our sequencer, if we add a material parameter collection track and select our MPC asset, we can then create a track on this for diffuse albedo. If we open this, we can see it created a keyframe here already for us. And if we move our position on the timeline, we can create a keyframe here, and we can change the values that are plugged into this. So on this one, we've got 050505. So we've set this to 0, 0, and 0. We should see those values animate as they go across. So we'll go to this one and set all of these to 1. Okay. And so to see this in action, we need to assign that material to this object in our scene. So we'll take this and assign it. And then in our sequencer, as we play this, we'll see the color of that material change. So maybe not the most useful thing in the world for the actual look of an asset in your scene, but where it is really useful is for controlling emissive objects in your scene. So say we wanted this to act like a light bulb that's kind of slowly glowing as it turns on. We could have it basically be off at this point and then ramp up in its intensity to its on state. You know, that's one use case for this. You know, similarly, headlights on a car. You know, we can have this, you know, dim, go from off to on. We could animate these on and off for like a turn signal in an animation. There's quite a few use cases for it for light, you know, emissive objects, but maybe not so much for, you know, the overall look of a material. So that is material parameter collections in here. It's kind of a niche thing, but very useful. So we'll save this and close out of this sequencer. So a couple more things to show here. We'll go into our sequences folder, and I want to show you how to create a sequence without going through this menu. So we can right click the content browser and go to Cinematics, Level Sequence. So we'll create this level sequence. We'll call this SEQ another example, and we'll open up that sequence. So we don't actually have to have a level sequence actor in our level to reference in a sequence. The tracks in a sequence technically will reference specific actors in specific levels. And so we can see that a little bit here by adding this cube to our sequence. So we'll save this. We'll close this sequence, and then I want to go to a different level. So for example, we'll go to our lighting demo level, and I want to open up that sequence that we just made. So another example here. So if I open up this sequence, you'll see that cube that we referenced in the other level, it shows up red here. It says the object bound to this track is missing, and it has a binding ID. So that binding ID is like a reference hash in Unreal that basically says we need to find the actor named cube in the level called animation main. So we go back over to this level, we open up that sequence, all of a sudden it can find it again. So these are very specific tracks, you know, for actors in specific levels. That is one really important detail, and there's a great way to organize your levels and organize your sequences so that you can use the same sequence in multiple different levels. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get a little bit more into the advanced side of these videos. But essentially, that's where level streaming, level sequences, and sub-sequences really start coming into play. So more on that later, but just keep that in mind. So we're going to delete this track for the cube. and a couple more animation tools for cameras in Unreal. We've got some really cool stuff in here. So under the Place Actors panel, if we go to Cinematic, we've got Camera Rig Crane and Camera Rig Rail. So Camera Rig Crane, if we create one of these and snap it to the origin, this is a camera crane. And these are really great for doing 360 animations where the camera travels around the subject rather than the subject rotating. So we saw how to rotate the box by rotating it as a animation track. What if we want the camera to rotate around it instead? This is really useful for animating 360s of objects that are currently placed in an environment that has a background, that moves. It's not us sitting on a turntable like in a photography studio. It wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense for a car to be spinning in place in an environment, right? So you need the camera to travel around the car instead. And so the way we do that is with a camera rig crane. So we'll also create a cine camera actor, snap that to the origin, and we need to connect this camera to the crane. So we can roughly place this where the crane head is, something like this. We need to parent this camera to the crane, and it's as simple as dragging and dropping it onto the crane in the outliner. So now this is attached to the crane, and you'll see the crane has its own attributes in the details panel here. So we've got crane pitch, crane yaw, and crane arm length. And every time I adjust one of these, it takes that camera with it. So again, for our camera aim, we're going to create a target point, snap that to the origin and move it to the center of our box. And then we're going to have our camera look at it. So enable look at tracking, and then actor to track target point. So now when we take our crane and we adjust the yaw of it here, you'll see our thumbnail start moving, but it looks a little bit weird, like it's not actually tracking the target point. The weird thing is, like, when I let go of my mouse button here, it'll snap into place. So I adjust it, it snaps, adjust it, it snaps. So it's a little bit of an annoying thing in the viewport, but you'll see how it works when I animate this as a sequencer track. So we'll reset this back to the default for the crane yaw, and then we're going to add the crane to our sequencer. And then on this, it has no tracks by default, so we need to add them ourselves. So we'll say plus track, and then under crane controls here, we've got crane yaw. And we can keyframe this. So on frame 0, we'll add a keyframe. And then on frame, say 120, we'll set this to 360. So we have an auto key here. So now when we play through the time slider, you'll see that camera tracking its target point in real time and rotating around in a 360. So camera-based 360 rather than object-based 360. This is super useful for doing 360s of things that live in environments. So that is our camera rig crane. You can also animate other attributes about this, like the arm length. So if we add a crane control for crane arm length, and a control for crane pitch. All right, so say halfway down our animation here, we want our crane pitch to kind of be up a little bit higher. So first of all, we want to keyframe this at this level for the start and end position. So we'll add a keyframe here, and at this position, we'll add a keyframe. So we're kind of storing 0 on both of those keyframes. And we'll go to 60, and maybe we want this to be a 45-degree angle now. So if we play through this now, looking through our thumbnail, we do a 360, but it has a height move in it as well. So it's like a compound camera move at this point. So really dynamic, really easy to do. And we don't really have a camera cut track in here, so we can't look through our camera very easily, but we can fix that by just dragging our camera actor to our tracks. So we automatically get a camera cut. We can look through that camera and see what we get. We have this crane in the way, right? Like it's kind of hard to tell what's going on with that. And the easiest thing to do is just click into your viewport and press G on your keyboard. So the rig crane is technically like, it's basically an icon. So when you press G, it hides it, you know? So now we can play through our animation and see what we get. So we get this really nice dynamic 360 this way. Awesome. So we'll save this and close it. We'll make another new level sequence, and we'll show the other camera rig here. So SEQ camera rig rail. So we'll open this up. We're going to create a camera rig rail. And we'll go ahead and hide our crane. So the rail is a system in Unreal for drawing a spline to have a camera travel along. So you can see the little geometry preview that's on this. It's like two little rails with a little railroad car that goes along it that our camera sits on. So this works just like the rig crane, where we need to parent a camera to this for it to work. So we'll create a camera. And then we're going to move this until it's sitting on top of that little rail car. Okay. And then we're going to parent this to the rail. So now wherever the rail goes, the camera goes with it. Right? So same deal here. Say we want the rail to be sitting right on the ground. So we'll position it just right here. And then we want the camera to be tracking our cube. And for this example, we're just going to have it track the cube directly rather than creating a target point, since the cube is such an easy target. So we'll select our camera, say enable look at tracking, and we're going to track our cube actor. So the camera is tracking the cube, and wherever we move our rail, that camera is always going to be looking at the cube now. So we can take our rail, going to rotate this. We're going to select the little Bezier point that's at the end of this. So we got that selected. And we can move this Bezier point. But the great thing about this is we can hold Alt and drag, and it'll create a new point. So we're going to hold Alt and drag, let go, hold Alt and drag, let go, and do this a few times. So we've got a few Bezier points to work with. So what we can do now is we can select these little individual Bezier points and start dragging them around. So we can make a complex motion path with these really easily, right? And remember, looking through our viewport here, we can see the smoothness of our path by adjusting these and making sure that there's no kinks in here. So we'll take these, move them around until we've got an interesting path to follow. You can also rotate these points to help with that smoothing. So maybe I feel like one of these isn't quite smooth enough. Maybe I want this to be a little broader because it feels pinched. I can grab the handle on the ends of these and pull that apart, just like a Bezier point in Illustrator or Photoshop. This one feels a little bit pinched to me. So maybe we rotate this and pull it across. This one's definitely a little out of rotation. I'm going to get things smoothed out this way. So we'll take our camera rig rail, we'll add this to our sequencer, we'll take the camera, add it to the sequencer, and then we'll look through our shot. So on the camera rig rail track, we can add a track for current position on rail. So I'll select that, and this works like a 0 to 1 value. So 0% of the rail and 100% of the rail. You're kind of telling it how far it's traveled, right? So at frame 0, we'll keyframe at 0%. And then at the end of our timeline here, we'll say 1. So 0 to 1 here. You can see we travel along our rail as we go down the timeline. And if we come out of our camera to kind of see what's happening here, we can see our camera moving along that motion path. And it's always looking at the cube the whole time because we've constrained it that way. So this is a great way for setting up complex motion paths, for example, for a car vehicle tour. If you want a camera to have some kind of complex motion where it travels along a body line and then zips around and turns around to look at the interior, you can do some really fun stuff with this asset. So that is the camera rig rail. So we'll save that, close this. And that's most of the tools that are applicable to automotive animation in here. We'll see a lot more when we get a little bit further into the advanced series. We'll set up a 360 specifically for a car and get camera settings dialed in. We'll animate some focus settings, lensing, and then we'll set up a really complex camera sequence in that class where we will do multiple cuts within one sequence that switches between 5 or 6 cameras that all have their own thing. We'll show how to edit those things together within the sequencer, and generally just do some really cool stuff all within Unreal Engine. In this one, we talked all about animation in Unreal. We talked about how keyframing works between Maya and Unreal, how it's a little bit different, how to animate a single actor multiple times using different level sequences. We talked about animating the details on a camera, using the graph editor, how to constrain a camera to a focus point and an aim point, and then we took a look at camera rig crane and camera rig rail. In the next video here, we'll talk about how to start rendering stuff out of Unreal. So how do you get EXRs, PNGs, JPEGs out of Unreal, and what are the render settings associated with that? So you can look forward to that in the next video here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you there. If you learned anything from this free video on YouTube here, please leave me a like and consider subscribing to the channel, and look forward for the next videos.